Chapter 1 The Man from the Hut. The huts stand on the edge of a small village. Built first for German soldiers, then used by Poles, they now accommodate refugees from East Germany. They hold 5 times as many people as the village itself. From one of them a man emerges. 45 years old, with gray hair, he has a look on his face which at first gives the impression of ironic laughter. But, as though frozen stiff, his face never varies. The man once had a wife, 2 children, and numerous relatives. He possessed a home, owning a well-stocked farm. He possesses now, that is to say, has possessed for 3 years, for he used to be a soldier, nothing but what he is carrying on him. No more and no less. He has a wire contraption with a palliasa and a military locker which he shares with 2 other men. 5 men are living in his room in the hut. The man has a roof over his head, a bed, and a third of a locker. He has work. He works 8 hours a day building roads at 78 Pfennig an hour. He earns 34 marks and 32 Pfennig a week. He has food. Occasionally he gets hold of a bit of old clothing, or some homegrown tobacco. One cannot say that society's provision for him has failed, and the man himself does not complain. Indeed, he speaks only occasionally, recalling his house, farm and stock, his parents, wife, and 2 children. In so doing he blooms like a flower and grows livelier. From being a has-been he becomes a person again. He comes to life only in a dead world, for it is a world that exists now only in his memory. He does not speak for long, however, but slides back into his silence, always ending with the same question, "Well, tell me, who am I, then, and what am I set for, and what is the sense of it all?" He expects no answer. The question hangs about as frozenly as the look on his face. The state cannot answer it, for the state knows only such concepts as the leveling of burdens, the creation of work, land reforms, and small settlements. But none of that is what the man means. Society cannot answer it. Society has knowledge only of things like care committees, goods collections, refugee aid and emergency equalization. But none of that is what the man means. In the state's world and the world of society the man is a registered number in an enormous card index. Yet he is a living entity and an individual human being, putting a quite concrete question, who am I, for what purpose am I living, and what is the sense in my existence? The 4 other men living in the same room with him put the same question. It hangs like a cloud over the whole camp, over a whole country, over a whole continent, really without expectation of an answer. Yet there is a trace of expectancy in it, a suspended perhaps which some day might receive an answer. This question thrust itself quite suddenly upon the man from the hut. Once he would have been able to dispose of it without difficulty from the assurance of his settled background. He lived in a secure shell and was conscious of possessing a settled shape. Now he is before a dark abyss of nothingness, and is shaken, as any other human being would be, to the very core. He is brooding in an empty room from which everything which hitherto had given him sense and a purpose has been removed. With the consciousness of nevermore, he stares into the void of nothingness. Despair has given him that strange look, as though he wore a fixed ironic laugh. The man does not stand for himself alone. He represents also the last stage of an historic development and its extreme limit. Not merely for 3 years, but for more than 3 decades. The man's question has been hanging over a country, stretching over a continent, slowly spreading over the whole planet. For more than 3 decades piece by piece the man has been losing his former existence and the possessions which gave shape and meaning to his life. The generation whose years bend like an arc over the abyss of the 3 decades is getting smaller. 2/3 of their life is spent. It fell to their lot to experience the eruption and domination of a strange sinister power. They cannot count on seeing the outcome of this domination, but what they can establish clearly from their own experience is that the flow of history no longer bears us forwards in a rushing stream, but is carrying us round and round in circles. Drawn into a gambling game, each individual is asked to stake his all, life, home, family, profession, and property. Millions have already lost everything. But the game is not yet ended. The man from the hut has retained his life. That is all. Numbers of other faces appear with his, staring into the void of nothing with the consciousness of nevermore. They tell their stories as he does, circumstantially, soberly, and unsentimentally. And, like him, They end by asking, "Who am I, for what am I living, what is the sense of my existence?" There are the faces of survivors from the First World War, when the security and privacy of man's shell were shattered. Faces from the ensuing political, social, and business spheres when the individual lost a large part of his stake in life. The vacant faces of the unemployed, who were puzzled to find themselves suddenly stranded. Faces which had been on the far side of the barbed wire, and, returning, found nothing but a smashed life before them. The face of the man from the hut is representative of millions of men from whom everything has been taken away except life, and for whom life has lost all meaning and purpose. 3 decades are half a lifetime. If for such a period no change can be recorded save the increasing violence of sinister power, while more and more people are dragged into a losing gamble with destiny, then human reactions begin to change. Not long ago it would have been unthinkable for a man to talk so soberly and objectively about the utter collapse of his personal life. He would have given vent to outraged feelings, been an easy prey for anyone directing him to the source of injustice in the world. The question of guilt, which makes sense of such happenings, was easy to propose and answer. Who is to blame for what is happening in these days? Many answers have been given and accepted, but they can be divided into 2 categories. Either what happens is independent and autonomous, and therefore alien to man, subject to laws of its own. Or the other man is guilty. In the former case man's task is to recognize the laws behind events and to adapt himself to them. It is the conclusion of those who are convinced of the supremacy of human reason. The second conclusion is more satisfying because it invites instant action. The other man, being responsible, can be punished and eliminated. He wears many masks, the other nation, the other race, the other social stratum, the capitalist, the socialist, the communist. But always it is the other man who is to blame for everything. Neither answer satisfies the man from the hut. The attainments of science over 3 decades have proved unable to change the course of events, they have merely made it more acute. And the exposure of the other man has similarly proved powerless to change the world's course. The man knows one thing for sure: if at a single blow he can be deprived of home, family, profession, and possessions, and if these occurrences are in some way so natural as to be legalized by the state and normalized by society, something so monstrous must have happened, and the whole must have so prodigious a meaning, that it can neither be comprehended by a scientific theory nor can the other man be the cause of it. There must be something behind it, something more tremendous than the other man or the peculiar laws of events. 3. The man from the hut represents the last stage of an historical development and its extreme possibility, the condition of despair. But despair, even when normalized and legalized, cannot be a permanent condition. It is always a transition state, either presaging the end, or else affording a bridge to something different. Something is going on within, something is being hatched that will only reveal itself later on. A possibility in what direction? In the days of the big bomber a man and a woman only slightly acquainted found themselves surviving together. The man had lost his wife and both his children. The woman had lost her husband and her child. They went off together into another part of the country to another life. Hitherto both had known who they were and for what they were living. That was so yesterday. Today it was no longer so, and they both jumped over their own shadows and plunged into a new existence, over which the glitter of a demonic freedom seemed to lie. Thus there is the possibility of intoxication. Intoxication is born of anguish and precedes despair. In intoxication, anguish is no more, and despair has not yet come. A magical feeling of might and power and of great freedom takes possession of man, and he says, "I do not wish to know any longer who I am or to what end I am living, and I do not wish to follow after knowledge." Intoxication hangs a merciful curtain over past and future and blesses man with blindness, projecting all that is essential in him into an instant of time, in order to provide him with duration and permanency. But man's nature is not such that he can bear intoxication for long, or find in it release from his situation. Knowledge was also given him, and he cannot escape from it. It catches up with him. Only in utter extinction of the self could intoxication be complete, and when life rejects the act of self-annihilation it is thrown back upon itself, emptied and used, and surrenders man to despair. In intoxication the decision is merely deferred. In anguish man does not experience the nevermore of despair, but recognizes its possibility. He retains his own shape and shell, and everything which fills him and his world with purpose is at hand: life, home, family, profession, and possessions. He still knows who he is and to what end he is living. But the possibility of the void is already there. Things stand in a pale light, throwing weird shadows. The reason may lie in the world outside, or in the man himself. Profession and property may be threatened by external circumstances, but they can also lose their sense owing to a process in the man himself. If anguish moves in the direction of despair, the search for drunkenness may begin, man seeking to extinguish knowledge. He frees himself from anguish and passes into intoxication at a leap, for the intoxication depends upon a sudden contrast between the once upon a time and the new-fashioned. Every repetition weakens it. It was greatest at the beginning of the historic development which bit by bit was to take from human beings the sense of meaning and purpose in existence. The intoxication of August 1914, when millions felt a sensation of might and strength and a liberty unheard of, has never been experienced in such potency again. Even the intoxication of 1933 and 1934, or that of 1944 and 1945, was not comparable to that of 1914. One can thus infer the degree of anguish which must have possessed men before 1914 and the possibility of the void which had overtaken them. If one contemplates those men today, either in memory or through their surviving personal testimonies, one characteristic stands out with peculiar vividness: they knew to the last detail who they were and for what purpose they were living. They possessed a shape, self-contained and clearly defined, and they sat in a shell most admirably appointed and equipped, and containing everything in plenty: life, home, family, profession, and possessions. If the possibility of nothingness bursts upon a man who is so certain who he is and to what end he is living, and who is so secure in the fullness of a well-provided residence, then the degree of anguish must be mighty, for there is so very much to lose. If such a man succumbs to intoxication, the degree of intoxication must be proportionately high. Hence the frenzy of August 1914 is comparable only with the most delirious upheavals of Western history, the Crusades, the scourge of Attila, and the revolutions. It was in August 1914 that the gambling game, with human beings as stakes, began. "Now I know that I am alive," man shouted in a drunken delirium. Not many were capable of seeing that it was not he who was alive. Intoxication is always of short duration. It soon passes, and is weakened by each repetition. The feeling of might and power, and the swindling illusion of liberty, have no duration. When intoxication subsides, knowledge unveils to man the reality of nevermore and delivers him over to despair. Even the radiant faces seen at the beginning of that ripe August did not last long. Next year the black hues of mourning and the faded pallor of nevermore were already being revealed. Intoxication occurs in the brief passage from anguish to despair. Its power is broken when man's conscious knowledge overtakes it, and it cannot then be repeated. This also applies to those historical epochs marked by intoxication. Measured by history's scale, they have always proved brief. And if intoxication appears to recur in a community, it will be found that different social strata have been affected. This was, for example, the case in Germany. The intoxication of 1914 arose from the anguish of the gross bourgeois when faced with the possibility of nothingness. The intoxication of 1933-34 arose from the anguish of the petit bourgeois, the office employees, and a section of the working class, while that of 1944-45 embraced only a tiny layer of the population which had found security in the totalitarian regime. Anyone overtaken by knowledge becomes impervious to intoxication, and remains an unparticipating onlooker or the calculating fellow traveler when others succumb. The surviving war volunteers of 1914 did not fall into the same intoxication 20 years later, but used the delirium of others to increase their own rank or secure their appointment to inspection boards. In a similar way, 20 years earlier the opposition used the intoxication of the ruling class, with relative coolness, to strengthen their own position. If a whole nation is overtaken by knowledge, faced by the actuality of nevermore, it is already in a state of despair, with no further possibility of intoxication. Such is the case with the German people today, and all attempts to lure them into new frenzies are foredoomed to failure. For intoxication is the temptation of anguish. Despair brings temptation to evil. The apathetic lethargy of the man who stares into the void must not blind us to the dangerous forces gathering within him, liable at any moment to strike this way or that. The indifferent stare, characteristic of his state, is a mask behind which gigantic forces are at work. They appear, these forces, to be alien and demonic. They seem to flow from somewhere into the man. But they are the forces of his own being which afflict him, released by the nothingness. Home, family, profession and property, it is upon these that a man's essential nature depends, the strongest of the binding forces being normally the family. But with the decline of the family in the modern world, profession and property have gained greatly in importance and now exert an even stronger influence than the family. Home, family, profession and property repaid the man for the life with which he endowed them by giving purpose and shape to his own life. In despair, however, this essence which he imparted hangs as it were in the void, and keeps fluttering there like the cobwebs of late summer. It returns slowly into the man from whom it went out. That is to say, the man is receiving back as many powers as he had given out, but finds himself unable to make use of them, so that they afflict him and strain him to an unbearable degree. He becomes obsessed by them. To reabsorb and harness the forces of his being which he imparted is a protracted process of ingestion, not to be completed in a hurry. Meanwhile the unassimilated power becomes malignant and eats into him. Thus in despair a man is consumed by his own powers. He feels these powers as independent forces which have invaded him, which grow stronger as his own life grows weaker under their assault. He may think and speak, sleep and eat quite normally, but he often contemplates himself in amazement, marking the heavy pressure of the foreign body thriving within him. Despair is like bolting oneself in an empty room and vehemently affirming the nothingness. The man accepts the void in which he is brooding and says, home, family, profession, property, it has all gone. Good. There is only nothingness. That's how life is, that and no other way. Only a fool ever believed anything else. But if life is really senseless, with only nothingness behind everything, then nothingness is the whole sense of life, and everything which does not pertain to nothingness is false and without meaning, not worth living. In that affirmation evil is born in man, he has succumbed to the temptation of despair. The temptation penetrates the man who has begun to despair imperceptibly. At first it stretches over him as a possibility only, the thorough rightness of which begins to pervade him. If the essential characteristic of life is that everything which gives it sense and purpose can suddenly be swept away, then to care about it is to make it unnecessarily grievous. Only those live rightly who do not trouble themselves about anything. They are the clever, the successful, the children of light, and among them there is definitely a place for the man who has lost everything. With that thought his original thoughts fall away, and life appears in a quite different light. The veil of Maya has been torn to tatters. He discovers a new sense of freedom. The forces which have afflicted him have found their function. They no longer need to be elaborated and absorbed, but direct themselves against everything which retains the shape and is still possessed of security. They become destructive and disintegrating in their effect upon the outside world. And concurrently a change occurs in the man which in its negative aspect resembles the positive process of transformation and rebirth in the sphere of religion. The vital essence of the man is overcome and broken, without his ceasing to live. He runs on mechanically. It is as if a power were suddenly liberated from its tasks, and rattled off like a wheel into the infinite. A certain void immortality has been attained, something in the style of the Ahasuerus or the image of the Flying Dutchman. The man has overcome his death by himself becoming nothingness. Then it is that the empty liberty of evil, which has cast off all ballast, home, family, profession, and property, and is traveling light, displays itself. He man dwelling in a void finds all things suddenly become easy, inasmuch as it is possible to travel the shortest way to the fulfillment of his will, a way impossible for the rest of mankind. In the state of despair no man is proof against the temptation of evil, but succumbs to it, whether in thought or in act. The powers by which the man becomes supersaturated may break out with unaccountable suddenness. Such outbreaks, in which the despairing man inflicts pain upon others and himself, cut like lightning through the diffuse twilight of the state of coma in which he lives, smash up the completeness of form, and have the effect of a discharge. The degree and the increase of evil will, however, be determined by the degree of knowledge available to a man. It is always knowledge which determines the conditions of anguish, intoxication, and despair. Where knowledge is lacking, as in the animal, these conditions are unknown. Where knowledge is restricted, as with simple and natural men, the capacity for falling into anguish, intoxication, and despair is less. It is only in the sphere of good that the widow's mite is reckoned tenfold greater than the rich man's gift. In the sphere of evil it remains the mite that it is, even though it is doing ill to the best of its power. According to the degree of knowledge, then, the capacity for evil develops, and may reach daimonic dimensions. Men recognize this hierarchy of knowledge and evil within the community. Absolute evil always pertains to the upper grades of society, which have access to knowledge. That is why the Church speaks of the sin against the Holy Ghost, which cannot be forgiven. The peak of the hierarchy stands nearest to the good, not the farthest away from it. Evil is quite close to good, for which reason the devil is represented as a fallen angel. The religious, God-seeking man is also confronted by despair and nothingness, for in order to find God he denies himself, and in the cruelest self-discipline strips away everything that keeps him from God, home, family, profession, and property. He receives into himself the powers of his being which had been given to these things, eschews them, placing himself voluntarily in the void in which God's power can flow. It is the same void of despair. Only the plus or minus quality with which men stare into it is different. The man of religion goes into nothingness with the positive expectation that God will reveal himself, and that he will gain assurance. The other man goes into it without expectations, and therefore experiences it only negatively and destructively. The one goes up, the other down. One advances beyond nothingness and suddenly recovers himself and is renewed. The other turns away from the nothingness, but opposes himself to everything that has location and purpose. The demonism of absolute evil begins. The empty freedom of a life rattling off aimlessly is impelled towards a form which can give it shape. Without form man would disintegrate. Evil, too, needs a form, but being internally void, it is in no way bound to a definite form. It can choose the form it will, and changes often as it likes. The man who has succumbed to evil thus becomes a chameleon and a Proteus, able to imitate all forms. The devil was always accounted a transformation artist, the master of masks. As all these forms can have no content or inner meaning, they have to acquire significance by disintegrating other forms and drawing them into their voids. Hence those mythical figures which thirst for foreign blood in order to prolong their own existence. Hence also the restless business of Satan, ever on the hunt for souls, or seeking to remove men's shadows. An empty form casts no shadow. It has to populate the void within it, trying to compensate for quality by quantity. It has to legalize despair. The frightful thing about this condition resulting from the vacant life, of being unable to live and unwilling to die, is its absolute boredom, and the inability to attain self-forgetfulness except by the substitution of tension, sensation, and destruction. Historically, evil always manifests itself most potently when man has restlessly given over his soul to external cultural forms, and thus emptied himself, and when these external forms, for any reason, such as destruction from without or decay from within, are no longer able to satisfy him regarding his nature and the end of his existence. Despair then becomes general, embracing the masses in its totality, who are flung out of their security into the way of anguish, intoxication, and despair, and finally delivered to evil. That is why the devil always appears in the latter periods of culture, as in late Rome and towards the end of the Middle Ages. The Christian view of history is sound in causing Antichrist to appear in the necessities and trials before the end, when his kingdom is set up for an allotted time. Thus it is today. The countries of the West, living in a terminal period which relates to them alone, for the rest of the world stands at a different point of development, are in a state of despair. It has been creeping on them for a century back. The clear-sightedness of the expiring 19th century recorded the appearance of the evil in the works of Kierkegaard, who had portrayed it as anguish before the good, in the figure of Dostoevsky, who had shown it as the long boredom of crime, and in the ideas of Nietzsche, who had pictured it as the senselessness and disintegration of all values. These three men, who had to suffer gravely for their knowledge, and two of whom broke down under the strain, sharpened our eyes for us. But the devil's incarnation has been reserved for the 20th century. We are in the middle of the process. The devil is in our midst. This devil, of course, is no longer on display as our ancestors saw him, with cloven hoof and horns and a goat's tail. A master of masks, he is now a smart man of business, traveling by car or plane through the world, now an upright gentleman of sober speech. He is an amazing organizer. He lectures, he writes books. Yet even now he often lets the mask fall and emerges in his true form. He thrashes and tortures. He runs the whole gamut of gruesome violence and mean deceit. He violates and murders and burns. Our world is full of his works. But despair is not an enduring state. It is always transitional. Either it marks the approaching end, or leads to another possibility. It is characteristic of the power of the West's knowledge of itself that it detected the peak point of brooding despair 3/4 of a century ago. European nihilism has long since passed the point of transition. The 20th century has left it well behind, and is now at the turning point of the drama's action, with the devil visible among us engaged in a gigantic work of destruction. That is the fact. And yet at the same time it is not the fact. For the moment the devil is visible again he loses his demonic power, which depends upon his invisibility in the diffuse twilight of dusk. Visible, he again becomes the power which means evil and does good. For the remarkable thing about evil is that it does not exist as a power in its own right. There is not a dualism between good and evil, God and devil, each standing opposed on equal grounds. The devil is involved in the order of creation and has his part to fulfill. His destructive power rages exclusively in the secure world where man possesses a clear knowledge of who he is and to what end he lives. Into this world the devil brings the brand of destruction and the acid of decomposition, in order to thrust men out of their protective shells and assured shapes into the anguish, the intoxication, and the despair where they keep company with him in their own vacuity. The void, the heavy brooding of despair into which he thrusts mankind, is a transitional state. It is in nothingness, where good and evil are in closest juxtaposition, and the destiny of the individual depends upon the fraction of a turn, that the true crisis of humanity begins. If the turn is not given, the individual becomes an instrument of the devil, but he then stirs up the fire in which the good is annealed like steel, though he has gambled away his own stake. It is at the point of nothingness that Western man now stands, and he must pass through and beyond it. The crisis of despair which the late 19th century at the peak of its knowledge anticipated has come. The crisis has become a reality for everyone. Man never stands collectively at this point, but always as an individual. The matter at issue relates to quality, not quantity. The man from the hut is individual, but he is not alone. He lives in a room with 4 other men who are like him. The hut contains many rooms, the camp contains many huts, and they are situated in a country which holds many such camps. The man is representative of innumerable men. Within the framework of the community the question of guilt is irrelevant. The man without a home, without a family, without a profession, bearer and victim of communal guilt before society, demands an equitable allocation of the burdens. And state and society have to recognize the claim. What can they do? At best they can provide him with a substitute. The state can give another residence, another farm with stock and land. Society can furnish him with another wife. He can beget other children, and begin a new life. So much without any question must be done. The man will war internally and externally against the community if it is not. But how far does it take us? Does it enable the man to understand the meaning of an historic development which again and again for over 3 decades has been taking away from him all that made his life worth living? Have the hidden elements in the process been illumined in such a way that ruin and death and misery have enlarged human understanding? Not a bit of it. The community demands forgetfulness and promises a future. In place of the old reality it sets at best a substituted new reality. The game proceeds. A new round begins. But who gives any security that the new path will not again travel in circles, and men will not lose their stakes again, as so often in the past? The man inquires as an individual about his own affairs, which he cannot forget. The community offers him something else, which can become his own only to the extent to which he does forget. In the best instances it replaces what he has lost, and then awaits a rebirth, expecting the man to begin a new life. Cause and effect are here regarded as perfectly obvious, but are home, family, profession, and possessions values which can make a rebirth possible? Within the framework of the community, man sees not his own guilt but that of the other man. And the other man ensconced behind brightly lit windows, is always a sight to make one angry. In despair, however, ground for a new existence is found through confession of sin, for acknowledgement of personal guilt is possible only when a man is able to face himself, i.e., when he no longer is what he was. Within the community, however, there is no such new ground in despair. It is the most tragic aspect of the situation that the community, desirous of unburdening itself, can do no other than push the guilt onto the other man, thereby blocking the way for individuals to confess their own sins, thus confining them in the province of evil. Hence the power of the evil is always growing in communities, and may reach satanic proportions. Confession of personal guilt shows men the way through memory into the future, whereas the community can only point to the future by way of forgetfulness. Confession of personal guilt sets man as a transformed individual in a world whose condition is no longer the paramount concern. The community can only place a man as he is in a world which demands broken pledges as the price of its maintenance. Through communal guilt, shifted to the other man, evil thrives enormously. In confession of personal guilt it is extinguished where it originates, in the soul of the individual. Here the connection between individual guilt and external occurrences becomes obvious. Personal guilt, limited as it is to hidden private matters, seems far removed from great historical affairs. Nonetheless, confession of guilt releases great power, since it transforms human beings. What if the hidden meaning of the crisis is man's need of conversion? That he introduces himself unchanged into new conditions, and, like the restless Ahasuerus, keeps forever appearing as the same person, a being demoniacally shut up and torpid in his past, throughout the change and collapse of his own world? If that were the case, attempts to reach the meaning of historical development by way of consciousness would come to a dead end, and the effort to influence events by merely modifying external conditions would be vain, as indeed has proved the case. Access to the meaning of the historical development would then not be obtained up here, by way of observation in the modifying of the external world, but could only be gained deep down, that is to say in the inner realm, where the individual in a state of despair confesses his own guilt, and goes on to repentance and reparation, and hence becomes a different person. Such confession is not the product of consciousness, with its mastery over the technique of logical thinking, but springs from a perception realized only in the depths of the complete and unified individual existence. Modern man has cleverly elaborated numerous systems of ideas, writes Max Scheler, in order to elude the rising flood of guilt in him. This is the basic behavior of the most modern human type, which appears to have finally emerged from the structure of Christian life. The guilt of the epoch has been allowed to accumulate and grow to such an extent that so far from atoning, the moderns do not even dare to feel it and think about it. And the sense of guilt which they have guiltily obscured, emerged as a purely objective force of circumstances, economic circumstances for instance. His own unrepented guilt or that of his fathers rises up before modern men like a ghost, in which his soul no longer recognizes itself. The question put by the man from the hut would thus circuitously be directed back upon himself, for external occurrences would only be the result of the cumulative personal guilt of innumerable individuals, only to be overcome to the degree that each individual in the secrecy of his conscience recognizes his guilty faults, and, through repentance and the desire for reparation, becomes a different person, including the man from the hut himself. It is no easy matter, the confession of one's own guilt. It is not merely a question of remembering how things went with wife and children, parents and relatives. Such recollections come and go of themselves, and bring with them the despairing glitter of nevermore and the readiness to repent. But that is not the whole of guilt. Ultimate guilt lies deeper, and asks not about the orderliness of the home, but about its reality and justification. Home, family, profession, and property. So long as they were there, the man knew who he was and to what end he was living. When they no longer existed, he no longer knew. It is precisely there that personal and historical guilt begins. Man's existence as an individual can rest too much upon these things. He will be dying his own individual death without any home and family, without any profession or occupation. Existence has not become senseless and despairing because it has lost the things upon which it was based. It has now become clear that such existence always was senseless and rooted in despair, just because it based itself on such things alone, and ignored the fact of personal solitary death. Thus St. Paul wrote, "Let those who have wives live as if they had none, let mourners live as if they were not mourning, let the joyful live as if they had no joy, let buyers live as if they had no hold on their goods, let those who mix in the world live as if they were not engrossed in it, for the present phase of things is passing away." Living only in the reality of this world, man feels a great deal more security and certainty than his true nature warrants. Herein lies his peculiar guilt, and for what has happened in the last decades, centuries have been making ready. Guilt is at the same time both personal and historical. A strange and sinister power has now emerged, and for more than 3 decades has affected the reality of this world and been taking from man one thing after another of all his possessions. More and more it has proved the unreality and deceptiveness of the world upon which he founded his existence, and shown that it is precisely the multiplicity of security and safety which each man claims as of natural right and as the reality of his existence which shatters our world. Home, family, profession, and possessions, these are the foundation stones of a human existence. How can a man be guilty if he bases himself upon them, and how can evil grow up thence? He becomes guilty because, in basing himself upon them, he ignores an essential part of his being. He is an unfinished and imperfect being who never can say with certainty of himself who he is and to what end he is alive and what is the meaning of his existence. It is God's nature, wrote Luther in his commentary on the Epistle to the Romans, to make something out of nothing. Therefore God cannot make anything of someone who is not yet nothingness.